Hi, this is Michael Waits, and welcome back to the Asia InsurTech Podcast. Today, we're joined by Arvind Swami, a director of FSI at Red Hat Asia Pacific. Arvind, it's great to have you on the show. How are you doing? By the way, I love your chair. The gaming chair is like a great thing to have. Anyway, how are you doing?
Good. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me around. On the chair, this is one of the luxuries I was able to get approval for from the home office as part of the pandemic. But it's great to be here, and it's great to be as part of the conversation with you.
I'd love it. Okay, look, let's get a bit of your background for some context before we jump in.
Sure. So I've been associated with the financial services industry now for 25 years plus, and I've been on all sides of it with consulting firms, with associated with financial institutions, as well as with the vendor space, with the application vendor space. And I've seen all sides of it. And having gone through it, coming to Red Hat, which is a technology company, the first question everybody asks, what are you doing there? But we realized that in the last 5-6 years, as you would have also seen, that there's been a significant jump in how financial institutions have started leveraging technology. And we continue to see that. And one of the big areas we see in 2023 is going to be around data.
That's true. Look, from your perspective, and I love the fact that you've been involved in this come from kind of a 360-degree perspective, can we dig into this idea of this use of data? Like, how big of a priority is this for company data analytics, and all the insights that come out of it?
It's a fascinating topic, Michael, because if you realize it, we've been around the block for some time. This is nothing new.
No.
Financial institutions have tried it, a lot of times. But what has shifted, I would say, is the customer angle associated with it. So let me take a step back first and talk about what I see as the insights-driven businesses tend to do better. And what I mean by that is not just internal, but external. So let's explore the internal angle first. When you're looking at data for your planning, when you're looking at data to helping with your customer productivity, I think that is an angle which gets missed out quite a lot. People tend to focus on the external side, which is the customer side. Now let's come to the customer side. And as I was alluding to earlier, what has shifted? Customer expectations have shifted dramatically. What they want, and this term, this is the beauty of technology and finance, the new terms keep on coming and going. So this term of hyper-personalization, which is coming across, that how do you manage the expectation and how do you hyper-personalize? And that is driving the additional focus, I would say. And in order to do that, you need to know the customer DNA. And how do you know the customer DNA? Is through data.
But how do you do that, right? How do you combine this idea of understanding what the customer DNA is with just the raw data, right? Because I think there's this misconception is if you just have all this data, then you're just much smarter than you were before. And in fact, you're not at all, unless a few things are correct. One is that the data is clean. And two is that it's relevant. And three is that you know what to do with that data and how to create insights out of it. Is that fair?
Absolutely, because again, I go back to the point, and we're talking in the InsurTech piece. Insurance has been collecting data forever.
Yeah.
Forever. They have, I would say, amongst all financial institutions, the most data available. The problem has been, as you highlighted, it has been siloed. Yeah. So we've collected a huge amount of data. In a lot of instances, we don't even know what we're collecting. And it's getting worse, right? We're collecting a huge amount of data. Excess data, which we don't even know what to do about it. So the first thing that comes in where I look at it, Michael, is what do you want to do with it?
Right.
And what is your understanding? When you say hyper-personalization, great term, but what does it mean for a customer? So if, let's say, you're driving insights-driven recommendation to a customer, then you need to know what data is required to analyze customer behavior and their expectations so that you can analyze it and drive that kind of, campaigns or that kind of product profile to the customer. So the first thing you need to know is what do you want to do? The problem has been, as in the last 2 or 3 years, we've been more bothered about let's gather as much as possible. We'll figure it out. What do we do with it later on?
Yeah, but how do you filter out the stuff you do need versus the stuff you don't need? And one of the questions I always ask is, like, what's your expected outcome? And I do this in a lot of different situations, right? But the idea is, I'm gathering all this data. What do you want it to be when you're done with it, right? In other words, how do you get to those insights, right? Because it's not known at the beginning for sure.
It's not. And there are two parts to it. There's no simple answer.
No.
The first one I would say is you might be very clear that, hey, this is your organization profile. This is your business model. In order to try my business model, if let's say I want to have 3x or 8x product offerings per customer, then I know what do I need to capture from a customer perspective around those profiles, around those behaviors, so that I can then campaign or market these things to the customer. Right. But the other side is the unknown. And this is the piece which I think everybody is grappling with, is how do you handle the unknown? And yeah, apart from privacy and regulatory concerns, I think if you can capture as much as possible, I would say go for it, because the space is evolving so fast that you don't know how your business model changes and what 3 years of data you need to see how the customer behavior changes aligns to that model. So as I said, there are two parts to it. You know what you know, and you capture according to it, but you don't know what you don't know. And as long as you're not crossing the boundaries of security and compliance and privacy, right, having additional data, there's nothing wrong with it. The only problem is how are you handling it?
Arvind, can we dig a little bit deeper into this idea of understanding a company's DNA? Because the raw data is great, but most people's interactions with a company is not through the data, it's through the people with whom they're interacting, right? And if a company's doing the right thing and they have a strong enough culture, then you can understand how that culture gets imbued into every employee. And yet over time, I mean, look, Red Hat's a relatively new company, if I remember correctly. I'm going to think 25 years, but I don't know. But you know what I mean? But when you go to big companies that have been around for 150, 160, 180 years, like insurance companies have been, how do you understand what that DNA is and then work with them together, right? Because this is key. I talk about partnerships a lot, but how do you work together with them to make sure you're going in the right direction to get the right stuff back to them?
Wow. Okay. We're going back in time, but you are absolutely right. It's a huge culture issue.
Yeah.
Insurance companies in general, and not in a negative way, tend to be more conservative, more orthodox. They've captured a huge amount of data. The biggest bugbear I have is they haven't used it.
Right.
Yeah. When people talk about startups, fintechs coming up, the traditional organization, and I'll put them in the ones which fall in the 100, 150, I won't call them legacy, I would call them more traditional. They always had the advantage of leveraging this data. Just imagine a startup coming in and trying to look at a market and trying to look at which customer segment and what behaviors and what am I going to market. How do they know?
Yeah,
whereas
exactly.
the traditional organizations always had that data. So the point you're making about culture is extremely important. That how first this whole thing about this is my data. How do I get away from that?
Right.
Because these large financial institutions, the traditional financial institutions tend to be very large. And they are organizations within organizations. And they've created this whole culture of this is mine, I will protect it. Then the second piece comes around the policies and compliance. These are regulations. And this is not a choice. You can't just, share here and there and land up in a soup with your regulatory authority. But the culture of, I have this data, what can I do with it, seems to be missing a lot of times. A lot of times it's used more in a reactive manner in terms of, how am I building patterns for fraud, rather than, how can I sell more? How can I service my customer better? The customer experience a bit. How do I take care of it? And that's been missing significantly. So you are absolutely right. The culture of you have all of this, you're sitting in, to me, the data is the new gold. Or the new oil, which is more expensive these days. But the question is, how do you use it? Always has been a culture issue that we've collected, but we've just sat on it.
And the flip side of that is not just how do you use it, but how can you use it? Look, when we're building our business, one of the things we have to go through is through this entire what's the right word, right? Like data regulatory and data governance aspect. When we deal with big companies, they have to make sure at first that we comply with GDPR and all these other things. But that's different region to region, country to country. And for global businesses like yours, like how important is that and how complex is that? That's really the better question.
So I would say there are two elements. The first element is, even talking about the traditional models, the way we collected data, that has changed significantly.
Right.
The number of sources or the type of sources where data can be collected has changed significantly.
Yeah.
That's the first thing that has happened. Direct and indirect both. And insurance industry knows this better because they've been doing this kind of white labeling, agency business, bank assurance for a very long time.
Yeah.
So both direct and indirect sources. So that's the first piece. The second piece is, how do I process this data? Now, what do I mean by that? In the traditional world, we would have said, hey, let's put all of it in a centralized location and let's see what happens. Yeah, you call it a data lake, you call it a dirty lake, whatever it is.
Right.
But that's what was the norm. Now, that cannot happen anymore simply because the volume of data has changed significantly. There's a huge element of latency which gets associated with transferring this data centrally, bringing it back, processing it. If I'm looking at things like hyper-personalization, I cannot be waiting for a day for the data to be processed and be brought back for me to do or act on it. And when we're looking at these super apps, they need it immediately. So what I'm saying is that the number of sources have changed, the way you store data has changed. It will not be centrally, it will be at geocentric locations. And the third piece which has changed is how this data transmits back and forth to be able to make sure that you're processing it fast enough to be able to provide that requirement to the end customer or the end user. What this means is basically you're changing the paradigm completely. In the traditional world, a lot of the architecture was based on, hey, where's the infrastructure located?
Right.
Or where's the application? It used to be application-centric. Then they said cloud-centric. Well, let me throw something out. It's going to be data-centric because it's going to be dependent on where your data sources are, how are they set up, and how are they processed. So that is the first piece that you need to keep in mind when you're looking at it from your business point of view. Now that gets coupled with the challenges you brought in, which are data residency. And these are part of it, because when you're looking at a multinational, let's say operating in a geography large enough, and you're looking at one country which says, hey, data residency, it has to be in there. The other country says, hey, you can take X amount of data. Third country says you need to mask the data. And that's where I'm saying the data-centric model becomes that much more important, because you don't have a standard model. You have a model which has to cater for each of these requirements. And that's where we believe that going ahead, a data-centric model or data-centric architecture would be crucial to how businesses define how their strategy is going to be.
Yeah, and look, this becomes super complex. And let me give you a little bit of a story that I experienced myself. And this is years ago, right? When I was helping Goldman Sachs build out its portfolio trading business, the entire Asian business, ex-Japan, was based in Hong Kong. And yet, the Korean government, the South Korean government, regulated that all of the data associated with any stock trading business that was happening in Korea had to be stored in Korea. And we weren't doing that. And I literally had to physically move servers from Hong Kong and then install them in South Korea. And every country and every region has its own regulations and laws around this. But then it also raises risks. I want to add one more thing to this. When we first started installing PCs on everybody's desk, they had USB ports on them. You could put a thumb drive in them or an external drive and copy data out. But then they blocked those, right? So all these kind of risks are coming. Like, what are some of these new risks that people aren't thinking about with data-centric architecture? You see what I mean, though, right?
Yeah, no, I completely get it. There are a few elements. So we understand why data-centric becomes important. Now the issue is, how does this all work?
Yeah.
Because you're looking at multiple sites and all of these. The first thing that comes in is security.
Yeah.
How are you ensuring that these data, sets are secure? and you are compliant. So first is security, the other is compliance. That how are each of these data sets complying with the regulatory needs? Security has another element, which is which is thanks to how our world exists, where legacy and new technology exists. So you have cloud on one side, you have
Right.
hybrid cloud, which we propagate because we say that you have on-premise, you have private, you don't have public, you have multi-cloud. And when you look at the whole spectrum and you throw in the legacy architecture, which most of these insurance companies have,
Right.
exposing data or churning data becomes a risky element. Because all I have to do is I open an API for sharing some amount of data. And the next thing I know is somebody, if the security is not good enough, uses that channel to get into my legacy technology application and skims off a huge amount of data. So security is one big element. But the other element is not just these challenges, Michael. What I also think is we have to start looking forward. And I don't like the term future proof because there's no such thing as future.
It doesn't mean anything. Yeah. It really, let's be clear about this. It doesn't really mean anything.
But we have to start thinking that is our architecture capable of withstanding, let's say, 2 to 3 years? Because what we are going to see is there are going to be more and more regulations coming in this space. Sure. We are clearly seeing, if you take, let's say, even just the cloud example, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, everybody was like, my cloud strategy is I'm going to put all my applications on the cloud.
Right.
Whatever form, shape, and size it was, but it wasn't thought through in terms of how it should actually work out. And this is what we are saying even about the data center. Have you thought about these challenges around regulations? Have you thought about security? How are you taking into consideration the what if scenarios? Tomorrow, if there is something happening in your country which requires data to be moved out ASAP for whatever reason, how have you catered for it? How have you catered for a DR scenario where in the past, traditionally, you would remember this, a DR would be 2 boxes on the side and you would randomly test applications on it. That's not how it works.
No.
Central banks are asking the whole stack. Rather, they're saying A and B, and they're saying switch A to B, B to A on a regular basis. So keeping all of this and keeping that in the hybrid environment, how are you going to do that? So there's no simple answer to it. Let's be very, but the key thing here is let's not go siloed. Let's not go say I will go public cloud. Let's not say I will go this. Think of all of these considerations first. Think of a timeline, and then start looking at architecting with sufficient flexibility.
Yeah, and can we get back to this DNA thing, right? Because I think this also determines some part of what this infrastructure and what this data-centric, architecture should look like. And again, tell me where I'm wrong here. I'm super curious about this. Let's say in sort of a consulting capacity, you're working with a big company or a big insurer trying to teach them or help them build what this data-centric architecture should look like, right? But for every company, it's different, right? Because their locations are different, where they need the data is different, they need access to real-time data. I'm always super curious what it's like when a company like yours goes into another company and says, here's what we think, but don't you have to do a bunch of work? I don't know how long it takes, like months of work to figure out what is the appropriate architecture for this company in the context of the business, not that they just have today, but in the ones that they may want to build, right? And again, I don't believe in future protected, but what was the word I wrote down? Flexibility.
Future-proof.
Future-proof, I think is silliness, yeah. But it's got to be flexible, right? When I was building trading applications, I always said to the development team, think about the fact that this may change. I don't know how it's going to change, but think about the fact that to fix it, you don't want to have to go all the way back to the beginning and they rebuild from scratch. At some point, you will have to do that 3 to 5 years out. But during that 3-year period, how do you do that on a company by company basis to figure that out? Like, what does that take?
The piece you mentioned, DNA, I would say it's more culture, because where the management understands that this is important, both from an architecture perspective, but also in helping their business. Because if it is always viewed as an IT problem or a regulatory problem, it's never going to be solved, because then the approach is always going to be a band-aid approach. But when they realize that, this is where I was saying that the 2 angles I mentioned earlier was internal, external. Let's bring the third element of regulation or the unforeseen.
Right.
Yeah. If you say these three are connected, and as long as they understand these three are joined, then first things first, there is a degree of a stakeholder appreciation that it is a journey.
Yeah.
That's where it starts.
Yeah.
If you come up with an approach that, hey, by 2023, I need 400 applications migrated to cloud. Sorry, how am I going to explain it to you?
Right.
Right. So I do understand KPIs and OKRs and whatnot, all of these guys have, but it's not short term. Sorry, but it's not short term. It takes time. It's a journey.
So do you think, because this is the thing I think about a lot, and to be fair, I had to do a ton of work when I was at Goldman and building out these applications, working with multiple teams to figure out exactly how to change their mindset to do it. And I want to get to that in a second. But do you think most companies are actually prepared to do this? Do you know what I mean? Because I don't like the word legacy either. And I also want to make a point. I don't think that being a conservative company is pejorative, right? There are risks out there. So I don't want to use it in a pejorative sense. But if you're a conservative company, you're mitigating your risks in a way that makes sense to you. That's not going to destroy your business because of some cowboy attitude that somebody has in there. But how prepared are most companies to do this, you think?
So there are a few elements. And if you would have asked me this question, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, I would have answered it differently. Simple thing is fintech. What they did bring in, forget the model was successful or not. In some cases they were, in some cases they weren't. But what they did bring in was a sense of urgency.
Fair enough.
And what they did, they brought this urgency to the market with a lot of these guys who thought that the barriers for entry were so high to their business, especially in the cases of insurance. Suddenly they realized that they were disappearing. So that's the first thing I would say that has happened, that has forced people to sit back and say, hey, sorry, what do I need to do?
It's a good point.
The second thing is, we discussed this earlier also, is the customer expectation. With the fintechs coming in, not just the fintechs, but what I would say is that the cross-industry pollination with all of these, the Ubers and the Grabs of the world, bringing in some things into it, the customer sits back and says, hey, I want to see that in my insurance app, or I should be able to see that quickly in my insurance. So that is the second element which has come in. So it has been gradual. The third is, I would say, to an extent, open source becoming more acceptable also is helping drive some degree of community-based, that appreciation that, hey, let's experiment, let's try some new things, which were like, oh, in the past, this is my technology, I don't care, it's old, it's managed by one company. Now what you're seeing, technology innovation is happening fast. And what financial institutions, thanks to the first two elements, are thinking is that, okay, how do I use technology to do this? Now, good or bad, because there is a bad element to it where you try to justify a bad business model because you want to use a technology.
Right.
You want to use blockchain, so you try and do funny stuff with it. Right. But there are good use cases. So if you apply properly, so this is where the appreciation of trying out new technology also, I think, has gone up significantly. And I think these three elements have helped significantly.
Can we talk a little bit about some technical aspects of the way mobile technology works? Because I think mobile drives a lot of the data gathering as well, right? You said multiple sources. And most people, whether using an Android phone or an iOS-based phone, they have the ability to either restrict or give access at a pretty granular level. iOS does a great job at this. And of course, Android allows you to customize a whole bunch of different things. But I think part of the output of that is that a lot of customers are used to, like you said, not just the grabs in their insurance apps, but their best experiences online maybe come through e-commerce. And that's maybe most people's introduction to how mobile things impact the data and the information that they get, whether it's a recommendation engine or something similar to that. But then how do you convince a salesperson or a sales agent at an insurance company to then access that data and become smarter in the same way that an e-commerce company is? Because that's the expectation of most people that are using these things, particularly in a region like Southeast Asia or Asia, where the penetration is still relatively low, right? So in the US or even in Japan, where it's like overbroked and everybody has some kind of insurance, they're used to it and they can watch it grow slowly. But if my first experience with online is with Lazada or with Shopee, InsurTech or insurance is fighting with that experience, right? How do you balance those things and square that circle?
I'm happy that you brought up this topic of Southeast Asia and the unbanked population, because in Asia, there's a huge amount of it. Let's start with what telco has done rather than the iOS and Android piece. I would say that the 4G, 5G, what this has done huge is it's available to, I wouldn't say all, but to a larger population.
Yeah.
What that has further done is that access to, smartphones has become higher. Now, does that mean everybody will start using Lazada or Shopee in the rural areas and start doing it? No. But at least if you create the right applications tailored for them, there is a likelihood that the basic transactions like payments, remittances, there's more likely that they will do it through these applications.
Right.
And this is where you got to do a balance, that what you mentioned about how does the sales staff use the analysis and goes out in the field. Well, that also helps, because now you don't have to, in the insurance world, rely on a lot of paperwork. You can have an iPad and a salesperson going out and trying to do these policies or explaining this out and getting the signatures and sending it back, unlike a whole sheet of paper and doing all of these things, because insurance is a very process-driven. The more you make it easier for the end user, the more you will drive consumption, because everybody understands the importance of insurance. But everybody is like, oh, yeah, fine, I bought it, but how am I going to claim anything out of it? Because the process is so difficult.
Right.
So you are also using the sales staff to actually help your end customers understand, use it. So you're making the customer experience much better for the end users in all of these areas. So to me, that's the second element of it, that one is the smartphones and, ability to do basic transaction, pay your premium, in the smarter areas, maybe even do your applications for claims online, those kind of things. And on the other side, the sales force will evolve, because it's not going to be those carrying a bag with a handful of paper policies and signing it. They should be facilitating it, both from a selling as well as from a customer care and service perspective.
Is there a way that all of this data that's being gathered, obviously we talk about this in an anonymized way, right? But in a region where penetration is low, right? All of this data is being gathered. How do you then push that data in a way that creates insights good enough for people in remote areas? Indonesia is a good example of this. 18,000 islands. Like, it sounds like an exaggeration, but it's not. But now you have all this data and a way to educate them using the data you already have. So simplifying the explanation of what that product is and then pushing it out to them, because even 5 years ago or 6 years ago, before they had access to smartphones, they may not even have known what insurance was or understood it, but now they do. So now you're using that data for something else as well. Does that make sense?
It does. And I was, when I was in Indonesia, one of the times I was talking to one of the providers who was looking at insights to look at which of the areas are more prone to dengue.
Right.
And offer a product related to dengue in those markets.
Right. It would be useless to offer dengue protection in a place where there are no mosquitoes, kind of thing, right? But in places where they're massive, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and then what you're doing is, through these insights, you're looking at all of this. You're looking at, there is some degree of boundary between data collection, which is privacy and customer consent. But you could also look at how ethnicities, medically react, or and that could also be used in terms of offering products. But again, there is a boundary associated with it. I don't want to get into it. It's a huge topic on its own, which is the data privacy and customer consent. But a lot of this is important to create targeted products, right, which could help those markets which are currently don't have these offerings. So to me, this dengue example is a classic one that would be taken to some of these places where there is a need for it, but you would have known only anecdotally. But now that the statistical averages are high, those.
Right. And that's where you introduce those products, and you do that based on the data that you've gathered about those places. And frankly, the more data you gather, the more specific those products can be. I think a lot when people talk about hyper-personalization, that they misunderstand like where the proper data access comes from to actually create those products, right? Because you don't need to know so much about Arvind himself per se, but just people like you Because
a male, this age group, living in a city, this kind of a lifestyle has got a higher propensity to have A, B, and C. So for that segment, let me create this product or offering.
Look, one of the things I mentioned earlier was this idea that the mindset inside some of these companies needs to change, right? And I'm never sure if there's a generational change that needs to take place or if it's just an individual. I don't think it necessarily matters if you're 25 or 55, right? I'm closer to 55 than to 25, but nobody's ever had to convince me to use technology to make myself better at my job. But I'm curious if culture is important inside a company and the culture's connection to that DNA is important, if you really need to change the culture to get everybody inside the company to understand that data centricity is important and then how to use all of the things that we've been talking about to do that, because that's hard, yeah?
It's very simple. Let's put it this way, Michael. If they still want to target the new generation and want to get customers from the new generation,
right,
they better switch. Because the new generation is not interested in you coming up with a paper form and saying, hey, let me cover you for 25 or 30 illnesses which do not even exist in your market.
Right. Yeah.
Because these are the guys who have access to all sorts of search engines and can look at it and find out that why are you selling me a bucket load of products which doesn't even matter to me.
Right.
So I think a lot of this will be forced by end user requirement. And I think that's going to be the huge shift.
If you look at the way that customers and potential clients of insurance companies and even of InsurTechs interact with data today, and you look 3 to 5 years out, what do you think is going to change on the customer side? I mean, I think they're going to get smarter, to be fair. Because I saw this. I'll tell you about the precedents that I saw when you're done answering that question and why we ask it. But I'm super curious from your perspective, what you're seeing, because your view onto this is bigger than mine.
So, and I mentioned to you customer privacy and I mentioned to you customer consent. Customer are getting smarter.
Yep.
They want to know their data and they want to know what their data is being used for. They also want to have access to some of this data because we are seeing a lot of these third-party aggregation analytical tooling which comes in, be it in the insurance world and the banking world to create a wealth offering or to look at where my risk profiling is. So I think customer is getting more conscious about what their data is being used for. That's one.
Right.
Customer will want to use the data which the bank collects on their behalf to externally analyze for their own purposes also, because remember in the old days you could download some of these data or their financial statement onto these and you could do their own. They'll get smarter about it.
Right.
And I really think the expectation that if I'm giving you this data, what are you giving me in return is going to get higher.
Yeah, definitely going to get higher. Do you think that, again, with the access to more and more data, that customers themselves who want some kind of hyper-personalization, right? Like, I don't even want the same insurance that my brother has, and we're only a year and a half apart and probably look the same. But do you think it's going to be more possible for me to co-create with, not you, but you as a proxy for insurance company so I can have my own product?
I could come, and this is going to be, it's not going to be easy because the challenge is not can it be done or not. The challenge is on the insurance companies that can they have 18,000 different offerings to manage.
Sure.
So there will be, so what will happen is that I don't think everybody will be unique, but what you'll have is a base off the shelf. And then like what you order on the food delivery app, that do you want this? Do you want lettuce? Do you want tomato? What protein do you want? What sauce do you want? What nuts do you want? So that's going to happen. And that will get you to the closest of what you need. But this, what veggies do you want or what greens do you want will only come based on data that they analyze and see that this segment, these are the 4 different offerings I will create, and they can pick and choose from that.
I feel like if I had said to somebody 5 or 10 years ago that talking about data analytics and data centricity and stuff like this, they would just be like, oh, it's so boring. But do you find this exciting? Because I find, you can hear it in my voice, this is super exciting stuff, yeah?
It is hugely exciting, both as a company, because we operate in that space and we are more than keen on helping. But I think going ahead, data is going to be the key, simply because not just from a risk perspective, the analysis, hyper-personalization perspective, but there's going to be a huge element which is coming, we see, in the form of ESG and transparency.
What do you mean? What you said, ESG and transparency. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the piece there, and it's insurance might be to an extent, is going to be that, hey, where are you investing? Where are you investing my money? I want to see that.
Oh.
I don't want what I give for my wealth investments to be channeled into oil or natural resources or carbon sources. So this transparency element will come in. Which companies are investing in? Are they socially conscious? What companies are you investing in? Do they have the right governance? So this degree of transparency and all of this is going to come only once you have access to data. Because to me, this is why I keep on saying to everybody is that the architecture and the platform is most important. What you put as tooling around it can be anything.
Yeah, it can
But
change.
if you don't have the tooling, you can't do the architecture. It's like a startup. You have all the tools, but you don't have data. What are you going to analyze and offer?
Right. I mean, this is one of the, look, I read a book. I'm trying to remember the title of it. I think it was called Into the Googleplex. And one of the tenets of this book, if I remember correctly, was that the edge that gathering all of the data that Google's been gathering at the time, I think I read this book 10 years ago, so it was for 20 years, gives it such an edge in its ability to target and also to just determine where the right products are. And this gets back to this other thing about, like, who has more leverage? Is it an insurance company that's been around for 150 years, or is it an InsurTech that's been around for 150 months? I mean, 150 days, right? Because it's like, I think some of these InsurTechs are starting to figure out, and I love them there. You're right, because they create a sense of urgency. But unless you have a multi-billion-dollar balance sheet to compete against people that can create products, it's going to be super hard to disrupt without all the data and all the balance sheet. No,
Michael, let's complicate matters. It's not just insurance companies or InsurTechs. Let's add the big techs. Like you mentioned, Googles of the world most likely know you better.
Better than I do.
Anybody else.
Yeah.
And I was going to use that as an example, but then I said, hey, data privacy, data security, let's keep names aside. But would Google be in a better position to create an insurance offering for you?
So we can argue about this until we're blue in the face. My feeling, and I'll tell me where I'm wrong here, they do have more data, but they don't have the core competency around the actuarial responsibility and the math to be able to do that. And it's not just the math, right? Anybody can learn the math. It's the idea of getting back to the culture and the DNA. Some of these big tech companies, right, want to be in the banking business, want to be in the insurance business, because the financial services industry, the FSI stuff, you know this because you've been involved in it for almost 3 decades, is huge. And it drives everything in the world. Tech and finance drives the world, but they're not good at that. I think what's going to happen is that the insurance companies are going to turn more into data and tech companies, because they already have all the data and their DNA already knows how to interact with it. They just haven't been sharing that knowledge with other people. And once they go out and do that, they're going to have way more power, I think, than companies like Google and Facebook and even Apple.
2 things I would say to that. One is controversial, one is not. The first thing I would say is, this is where, remember, you were asking me what is bringing this change in the management, the culture, the DNA. And this is exactly it, what you pointed out, that they are scared not just of these fintechs, the insurtechs, but they're scared of the big techs, because they're worried that Google, for example, what would they want? They would want me to do everything with them.
Right.
Now, how do they do it? Do they do it themselves? Do they white label? You never know. Right. You could they might turn the insurance companies into utility companies and buy all of those products from them and package them and create it. So they want the whole of me. Now, so that's the whole thing, and that has shifted the mindset in traditional organizations, and it's forced them to sit back and say that this could be happening. If I don't make the changes, then I'm not there. So that's the first piece. Now, the controversial one, which you said that they don't have the know-how and is it easier to buy data or is it easier to buy the know-how? That's always going to be controversial, but I do understand the piece you mentioned is understanding industry is not that easy.
Yeah,
because coming into a technology company, that was a difficult enough experience for me. But understanding the industry is not easy.
No, it's not easy at all. And look, let's end on that. I think we've had
It
a
comes with gray hairs.
Yes, when you and I are both qualified then to do that.
Exactly.
Look, this has been a killer conversation, and I think I have to invite you back to do more because I feel like we could go on and on about this. There are so many things that we could dig deeper into. I really want to thank you for doing this. Arvind Swami, a director of FSI at Red Hat Asia Pacific. That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michael. Great to be here.